So I had this idea a while ago to make a table with a pair of Viking swords for legs, with each sword bent in half and the tip forged into scrollwork and other extravagant and unnecessary things. It turns out this would have been an enormous amount of work that would have taken an unreasonable amount of time, partly because the swords would have to be extra large to act as table legs, partly because an extra large portion of the work would have had to be done by hand instead of using power tools, and partly because the stainless steel I bought to make them was annoyingly difficult to grind. Not that it was that hard, I could use files to shape the stuff, but the angle grinder just took absolutely ages to cut the stuff away. So instead of making a pair of swords via stock removal, I made the decision to downscale the pair of swords into a quartet of daggers. I started by cutting a 7-inch length of 2-inch wide stainless and forged it into a gradual taper, going from 1 3/4 down to 1 1/4. It's a 1/4 inch thick, about 6 mm, and I didn't do anything to that, so it's all the same thickness. Forging stainless steel is fairly new to me, but from the little I've done before, I learned that you have to work it extremely hot or it starts cracking under the hammer, so the window you have to work in is much smaller than usual. Once I was happy with the outline, I forged in some simple bevels, just to save me some time on the grinder. They're very shallow, only about 1 mm each, enough to be noticeable once they're cleaned up, but nowhere near enough to make the dagger sharp. Once that was done, I decided to give the centre of the blade some texture, just to give some nice sharp contrast between the polished edges and the rough middle. So I just hammered away at it with the round end of the ball peen to give it lots of little dents. I usually don't have my face this close to the steel, but because you have to work this stuff so hot, the light it's giving off makes it quite hard to see where you've already worked and where you still need to do some more. With the forge work complete and the blade somewhere vaguely close to being the right shape, I started cleaning up the profile with an angle grinder. I didn't need to remove much material, just smooth things over and get rid of any dents left over from the hammering. Same thing with the bevels. I'm not sharpening them, just making them vaguely flat. Moving on, you may have been wondering why I only had a blade but no tang. That's because I realized I was going to need to weld part of this build together anyway. There's a component later in the video that I couldn't think of a good way of doing in any way other than welding it on. So I decided it would be much easier to weld on these 1/2-inch stainless steel rods that I had lying around anyway than it would have been to do this the quote-unquote authentic way. So I just cut off a 5.5-inch length, ground a slot into the end that the blade would fit into, and stuck them on. While editing this video together, I realized that I lost 2 parts of the build, both quite small parts thankfully. The first one is where I used my lathe to turn the last inch of this bar down to just under 8 mm, for reasons that will be apparent in a few minutes. The other part I lost was a section where I made these other tiny little things that you might never have realized that I never showed you how I made them. Points will be awarded if you can figure out which parts they are, how I made them, and what they're for. Incidentally, these welding electrodes are fancy E316L stainless steel ones, I think. I don't know what happens if you try to weld stainless steel with standard electrodes, and I probably don't want to know. Now that the tang is attached, I can go about putting the final grind onto the blade, which ate through an entire pack of 40 grit belts, quite a few 80 grits, and a handful of 120s. Next comes hand sanding, which I always find quite relaxing. And since there's no sharp edge on this one, I can completely zone out and just rub things without worrying about cutting myself. I can just stand there thinking about going through the entire rest of the build and figuring out any problems that might come, while just staring at the scratch marks slowly disappearing and reappearing. Once things were well polished, I took a die and cut some threads onto the last inch of the tang. If you want to know why I didn't just use a half-inch die, that reason will also become apparent later in the video. Now, you remember earlier I said there was a bit that I couldn't do without welding. This is that bit. This is the part that attaches the daggers to the table. I didn't want to just have a 90-degree bend at the end of the dagger. I had no way of forging something like this onto the tip, and every other idea I had was either weak, dangerous, difficult, or ugly. This is just a square bit of stainless with holes drilled and countersunk into the corners. There are some very tiny marks to let me know where to put the blade. Then I lightly tacked the ends so that I could just straighten it up a bit. I had this old steel boot sole left over from a very old build I did where I forge welded together some steel toe caps into a dagger. Now I'm just using this thing to protect the nice shiny parts from any accidental spatter. One thing I discovered when testing out these electrodes is that stainless steel is extremely heat sensitive, and it only takes a little bit too much weld heat to turn nice straight things into the curviest banana shapes, so I put the weld down very slowly. Moving on to the handle, this is a lump of discarded oak countertop, which I roughly cut into a square block. Why do it by hand, you ask? Because it was late, and I didn't want to make too much noise. I marked the center and put a small hole to make it easier to start the larger hole in the right place. Either my half-inch drill is drilling undersized holes, or my half-inch steel bars are oversized. Either way, it was a very snug fit to put the wood onto this mandrel. There's some thread on the end for a nut to hold it, and a short bit of flat bar with a half-inch hole in it to keep the wood away from the jaws of the chuck. There is also a center drill hole in the very end of the bar. This is not the right way of doing things. This is not a woodworking lathe. This attachment I made years ago has no adjustment for height or for depth. It's not very stable, but it kind of works. Kind of. Incidentally, whatever this woodworking tool is called is made out of an old bike shackle and a length of barge pole. No, I don't have the right tool for anything, thank you very much. Once it was fairly close to the size I needed, I took it over to the sander and smoothed it out. And, since it's on a bar, you can hold it lightly against the belt, and if you grip the bar just softly enough, then the whole thing starts spinning and it sands everything evenly. A little touch of fire to bring out the wood grain, and the handle will be finished. This is a doorknob. They are cheap and easy to find. This one happens to have a texture similar to the one that I have running down the blade. It's amazing how convenient the world can be sometimes. It's almost like I planned this out. I absolutely didn't. I'm not that clever. But it kind of looks that way. Anyway, I drilled and tapped it for 8mm. Conveniently, the same size I made a thread on the end of the tang. That I did plan out. I am not that stupid. Incidentally, if you want to know why I didn't use a 1/2-inch tap on the end of the tang, it's because the neck of this doorknob is only 15mm, which would have left me with a very, very thin wall. These are some solid pine floorboards. Conveniently, they come with built-in tongue and grooves, saving me the hassle of having to either cut them myself or having to use biscuits. I just glued together a bunch of them until I had a very big square. The tabletop I'm going to make is going to be a big circle, but I don't have a compass big enough to draw it out. But I do have a screw and a bit of string, which is basically good enough. If there is one lesson to take away from this project, it's not to let your complete lack of experience, knowledge, or equipment stop you from making really stupid things. Also, don't worry about the screw hole marring the table. I will deal with that later. I did the first few cuts quite a ways away from the line, just to make sure I remember how to cut reasonably straight with a jigsaw. These reinforcements are here because I don't trust the tongue and grooves to hold up. It might have been unnecessary, but it was quick, easy, and cheap. There were a few bumps at the joints that needed smoothing over, and I also needed to get rid of whatever finish it came with, so I sanded the whole surface down a little bit. The majority of Viking shield designs I saw on the internet looked really simple and rather boring, so I decided to completely ignore them and put a huge Celtic knot weave thing around the outside. And after a bit of trial and error, figured out this pattern, which I could trace onto the table over and over for a nice consistent weave. I just needed to make sure that the template started where the last one ended, and that it was always the same distance from the edge, and the whole thing worked out much better than me trying to draw this whole design out by hand. Of the many skills I don't have, drawing is right up there at the top. I considered painting the pattern on, but I decided that I was making life too easy for myself, and I needed to do something stupid that could ruin everything. So I welded a bit of flat bar to a rod and burned the pattern in. Because fire is better than paint, and slower, and harder to do, and harder to correct mistakes. And you get smoke in your eyes. But it's more fun. Anyway, once it was mostly finished, I touched up a few little patches with a tiny little gas-powered soldering iron that's really, really bad as a soldering iron, but a great tiny blowtorch. Slow, but accurate. After a very light sanding, the whole surface was given a single coat of varnish, just to stop it from getting too dirty. I glued together some thick boards into a large lump, 3 inches thick, about 7.5 inches wide. After sawing off the corners, I went over to the sander and carefully made the octagon into a circle. From there, I rounded off the top until it was a nice dome shape. This is now set aside for later. An 8mm hole is drilled where the screw was earlier, since I know that's the centre of the circle, and then a wooden dowel is stuck in that hole. This dowel is a guide for the jig that the router is held in, which lets me make nice round circles, unlike the lumpy circles I would make if I was trying to do this by hand. I cut one circle 10.5 inches in diameter and a smaller one at about 9 inches, giving me a nice step in the wood. Some more floorboards glued into a small square also has an 8mm dowel in the middle. This will be cut to fit into the hole that was made in the table. The reason I am doing all of this is because Viking shields have a part in the middle called the boss, which is normally made of metal and sticks out. I decided to make this one completely ornamental and out of wood, so I merely want to change the direction of the wood grain so that there's a nice sharp distinction between the table and the boss. Once the step was the right depth, the dowel that was used to guide the router is then used to centre the dome so that everything is nicely concentric and all the holes are hidden from view. After some light sanding to smooth things over, the ornamental boss was coated with some wood stain. I'm sure a proper woodworker would have used some fancy wood like walnut or mahogany or the such, but I have none of that, so if I want contrast, I have to cheat. Once I had given it a few more coats of stain, it was time to glue it into the tabletop. There's a small mark on the bottom of the boss, which I had pointing towards the interruption in the pattern, just to make sure that I had everything lined up nicely. I planned to put it in slightly off and then twist it to spread the glue, but in a rare case of me doing things accurately, with the glue in place, the two parts came together so tightly I couldn't actually twist it round. Finally, after several rounds of gentle sanding and varnishing and sanding and varnishing, the whole tabletop is smooth and shiny.